Hey everyone, I did one of these videos a few months ago and people seem to appreciate it, so I thought I'd try again. And so what I want to do, what I did then, what I want to do now is catch you up on some of the nonfiction I've been reading over the past couple months that I have not done more in-depth single video reviews on. So I'm going to take you through essentially kind of quick thoughts, quick reactions, quick mini reviews on 12 nonfiction books I've read in the past couple months. That, again, I did not do full, longer form, more in-depth reviews on. I have copies of a handful of them here. Some of them I got from the library, so I don't have physical copies with me, but nevertheless, I'll take you through my thoughts on them. And they range by style and kind of topics that they address. So hopefully there'll be something in here for most anyone who's a reader. And I'll timestamp below if you want to check out my specific thoughts on a particular title. But let's get into it. So the first one is the new book by Coleman Hughes, who's a writer, podcaster, kind of general up-and-coming public intellectual. Maybe not even he's just kind of arrived at this point. He's not probably up-and-coming anymore. Someone I followed for some time with interest, and his book is called The End of Race Politics. It is in particularly more progressive circles. It's a controversial idea because in a way he's kind of arguing to recover what he determines is the appropriate understanding of colorblindness. He actually is arguing, he's standing up for colorblindness in a way, and he's arguing that the popular clapback to colorblindness is really misunderstanding what, in particular, and this is, I think, an important part to know about what he's trying to do here. He's trying to argue, I think he's largely successful, honestly. He's trying to argue that the civil rights activists, the MLKs and the Bayard Rustins of that movement, E. Philip Randolph, had a particular understanding of colorblindness as related to law and policy, and that he is arguing that it's a misunderstanding of what they meant by colorblindness and the ways that most people clap back to, saying things like, I don't see color, and then responding to that kind of really shallow understanding of colorblindness. He thinks it's all missing the point, and he's trying to recover a voice at the table for what he would determine as a more appropriate understanding of colorblindness. This is particularly aimed at law and policy. So, my thoughts on this book, I thought it was good. It didn't blow me away. I think he's a really interesting thinker, and I think he's a very, very, he can articulate himself very powerfully. And I actually didn't find this book to be his best communication. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's because I think it's his first long-form book he's written. I thought it was very straightforward, very reasonable, very clear, very easy to understand. Just like a very sensible argument, and I agreed largely with what he's kind of concluding here. But I didn't find it to be. I thought there'd be a little bit more. I don't know if polemic was what I was looking for. I just thought there'd be a little bit more interesting turns of phrase or potentially controversial lightning rod assertions. And I found it to be very clear, very straightforward, sensible case. And I thought it was fine. I thought it was pretty good. I think if you are really intrigued by if you like him, honestly, if you like him and follow him, you're probably not going to pick up anything new in the book. But if you are intrigued by this idea that I just talked about recovering colorblindness or appropriate understanding colorblindness, or even you're not even sure what that even means, I think it is a great overview and a great kind of, again, super readable, super clear argument. So that's Coleman Hughes' new book. Keep moving along here. Next, I read The Identity Trap by Yascha Mounk. I read this because I heard him on an interview that I was impressed with, his ability to articulate himself, and so I grabbed the book from the library, and I read through it, and I initially really liked it, and there's still things I think are very good about it, but then I listened to what I thought was a very thoughtful and good critical response to it from a podcast called If Books Could Kill, and that podcast made some really good points about Yascha Mounk's kind of unfortunate deployment of anecdotes to make too many of his arguments, and I thought they made some really good points. So it kind of attenuated my reaction to the book a bit. Essentially, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. The Identity Trap it's one of kind of increasing number of books that are coming from a centrist I mean, he's a left person on the left, but sounds conservative because he's responding to kind of far progressive, far left cultural ideas, everything that trickles down from, wokeness, postmodernism, critical race theory, critical gender studies, kind of all that stuff. he's responding to the excesses of all of those movements, especially as they've kind of manifested in what he sees as problematic ways in local institutions like schools or school boards or whatever, local governments, universities, corporations. He's responding to all of that, and his argument is that there's this thing called the identity synthesis, which is that all these ideas have kind of coalesced around identity, and that there's an identity trap that our culture is potentially falling into if these voices continue to have kind of the lead in kind of cultural discourse. So he's critiquing all of that in the identity trap. And it's a wide-ranging book. It's a very ambitious book in its scope. And for me, the best part of the book, and I still think this even after the critical responses I've engaged with, the best part of the book are the early chapters in which he is summarizing postmodern philosophy. People like Michel Foucault, who's a very commonly kind of pointed to source of a lot of these ideas. I thought a really excellent chapter on critical race theory, actually. I thought that section of the book is the strongest part of the book and is still probably worth reading if you aren't someone who wants to get in too deep in the weeds and all of that stuff, like where do these ideas come from, and kind of, I think he does actually a reasonably good job at defending what are some of the good impulses or the moral or justifiable impulses behind what he determines the identity trap or the identity synthesis. So there's still really good chapters of the book, but I do agree there's some concerning elements, particularly when he puts forward proposals or he maybe over relies on anecdotes that can be widely misinterpreted to make some of his kind of points when it comes to cultural issues. So a little bit of a mixed response there, but positive on some aspects. I'd still, with an appropriate kind of critical filter, I'd still recommend taking a look at that if that topic's of interest to you. Okay, now shifting to a book that I have here right in front of me. This is called The Global Politics of Jesus, getting into some explicitly Christian publications now, by Nilay Saiya. I think I'm saying that right. A Christian Case for Church-State Separation. I loved this book. I thought this was fantastic. So he is someone who he's currently in. He is in Singapore. He's currently in Singapore, but he studied in America. He has a global experiences in terms of where he's lived and cultures he's experienced personally, which is what sets this book apart. This is essentially a neo-Anabaptist, if you know those terms in Christian tradition. This is a neo-Anabaptist kind of case for maintaining a separation between church and state, an argument for the church, to be its own politic, essentially, and to not be involved in the politics of the age, the politics of the world, the politics of government, etc., kind of leveraging the power of the state. That's the church-state separation line that he's arguing for. And what sets this book, in my reading and my opinion, what sets this book apart is the global aspect of it. He does a remarkably wide-ranging job of pointing to examples from lots of different parts of the globe, currently and historically, to support his point. So it's really not, a lot of publications of this type are focused maybe too much on just America or even just the West, similar cultures to America. And this book is not that. It really ranges through truly a global scope. And I love that about it. I'm primed. I've made comments like this on videos in the past. I lean strongly in that neo-Anabaptist direction already. So it's kind of primed to maybe agree with his conclusions. But I thought that the global evidence he brings to bear on his theological arguments is something that makes this book different and very worth reading. I really highly recommend it if any of that sounds of interest to you. So that's The Global Politics of Jesus. Next, very similar vein, I've kind of been reading in a little bit of a theme lately because of what I'm preaching and teaching at my church that I pastor. But that's Alan Kreider's The Patient Ferment of the Early Church. This has been on my radar for really since it came out. I got a lot of rave reviews when it came out. And I've been wanting to read it for years. I finally picked it up, and it's wonderful. It's fantastic. He is Anabaptist himself in that same theological stream I was just talking about. And so what he does is, but this is actually a pretty detailed look at the early centuries of the kind of Christian expression particularly in Europe or the Mediterranean, at least, the Greco-Roman world. And there's some really fascinating stuff in here about how the early church approached the ways that they formed and catechized and taught new members, how long it took for a member to get baptized into the church because of the risks associated with baptizing someone, or the risks associated with baptizing someone who turned out to just be kind of a spy that was trying to infiltrate the movement. There's really fascinating. He did a lot of research, a lot of legwork to look up ancient teachings, ancient writings, primary sources. This is an academic work. And there's fascinating stuff. He makes very fascinating assertions in there that, like, the early church really didn't actually work that hard on evangelizing. They actually worked really hard on just catechizing and training and teaching and taking care of themselves really well. And the way that they did that was so attractive that evangelism kind of happened naturally as an outflow of that. Fascinating stuff. There's also a lot of really interesting insights into how the early church thought about things like violence, or how they approached how and when people got baptized. If you're into church history, it's a must read. Got to check out Alan Kreider's work. It does get bogged down a little bit in some nuts and bolts, some details, some weeds on some of that stuff, especially some of the chapters that get really into the catechesis and in the primary writings. Might be a little dry if you're not into that style of writing, but man, if you're interested in that topic, Alan Kreider, it's a fantastic book. Highly recommend it. Yet another book on a similar theme is the classic second volume of Walter Wink's trilogy, Unmasking the Powers. I've been very slowly working my way through Wink's classic trilogy here. Engaging the Powers is next. I haven't even cracked it open yet, but The Invisible Forces That Determine Human Existence. This is a really well-known work. Walter Wink's a really well-known scholar in this area. I loved this book. I was surprised by how much I loved it. I mean, it's classic for a reason. It has detractors. There are people who think Wink overly kind of, I don't know if demythologizes is the right word, but maybe depersonalizes spiritual forces too much. I think that could be a valid critique. But I would say, if you haven't read Wink, but you've heard people comment on Wink, or if you read people refer to Wink, just go back and read his trilogy. It's so good. The first two books are so good. This one really focuses on, he's kind of making a case for how does a modern person, modern Western person especially, we live in a largely, it's Charles Taylor's term, disenchanted age. We've kind of drained the ancient worldview of spirits being alive and active. We don't think that way anymore. How do we then take seriously something like the New Testament asserting that there are forces, spiritual forces that affect our existence and our lives in this world? How do we take seriously the idea of a devil or demons or Satan or angels, all this stuff? And he's making a really bold case that we need to take that stuff seriously, but he's trying to kind of interpret and understand it anew within our secular disenchanted context. And I think he does an amazing job. There's critiques, quibbles you can make, but he takes scripture very seriously. He also has seen a lot all over the world. He takes those experiences very seriously. He's not condescending when it comes to other cultures that take spiritual matters or matters of demons and spirit and he's not condescending at all. He takes them very seriously. I think it's very respectful towards those cultures, and it's very challenging towards us Western disenchanted secular folks. And I think, I thought about this book a lot. I'm still digesting it and still thinking about it, but I think he succeeds in at least pointing the way for how to think about this stuff anew in our context. So yeah, love Walter Wink's work. I'm excited to get into the third volume, which is the longest one. It's probably I haven't cracked it open yet, but I'm excited to get into that hopefully in the coming months. Okay, continuing to march forward here. Yes, this is my next one. Atheist Delusions by the one and only David Bentley Hart. Controversial in some circles. I love his books, though. I love his books. I think the critiques are fair. Sometimes that his style is overly harsh, overly polemical, but man, I love his books. And I loved this book, Atheist Delusions. I do think it's unfortunately titled. I think it's unfortunately marketed. It was marketed to be kind of in that whole new atheists emergence in the 2000s to 2010 kind of era. I think it came out in 2009 maybe, so it's a little dated in its marketing. But man, set aside the marketing. I would honestly say set aside the title. I wish it wasn't titled Atheist Delusions. I think it's really unfortunate because this book is awesome, and it is an awesome book on church history specifically. And what he's really getting at, he's not getting into the philosophical weeds. He's not going toe-to-toe with some of the I would say pop philosophy that people like Dawkins or Dennett engage in. What he is going toe-to-toe with is their construal and the popular construal of the history of the church, particularly the history of the medieval church. He's going right toe-to-toe with them, and I think that he does a masterful job just demolishing the pop understanding of the church as this repressive, anti-science, institutional, cultural force in the history of Europe. That's the pop understanding, right? Is that there's even a Family Guy joke about it. There's lots of jokes about it in pop culture about how the church just holds back science and holds back progress, and it's when the counter-church forces of reason and secularism can break through the hegemonic control of the church. This is a pop narrative, right? It's only when those things can can break down the power that the church has, that science can move forward and progress can actually happen. He utterly demolishes that in his characteristic no holds barred style, which I love so much, and he just eviscerates it with his characteristic humor and his wit and his style, and it's so good. And it's also it's a legit excellent kind of summary of a lot of church history. So it honestly is a book of church history. It's not primarily a book of philosophy. It's a book of history, and it's a book of trying to like take down that argument and replace it with a much more learned, much more nuanced, much more, dare I say, accurate and reasonable and historically true narrative of the history of the church, which has actually been it's a complicated story, which he's not afraid to get into the complications of it, but the church has been way more on the side of science and progress and supporting and buttressing those things than ever holding it back. So this is a pop narrative that, man, I wish this book wasn't called Atheist Delusions and was called something else and still was getting a wide hearing, because that pop narrative still has some sway in certain circles, and I think that he just does an absolutely masterful job at correcting it. So that's my David Bentley Hart book for this video. Going on ahead, this is a book I don't have a copy of in front of me, but God's Own Party by Daniel K. Williams. Daniel K. Williams is becoming one of my... I loved his book, The Politics of the Cross, which I have somewhere around behind me here. I'm not going to take a minute to look for it, but I love that book too. Daniel K. Williams is becoming a scholar I'm really interested in, because I also loved God's Own Party. This is... I mentioned this book as a recent reading in one of my recent videos on the new fundamentalists in our culture. I've read a lot, and I'm still continuing to read a lot of history of particularly the 20th century of American religion, just because I'm super interested in the kind of evangelical Christian, Protestant, fundamentalist, all that stuff, that tangled mess, as it's been experienced in America. It's a very unique thing, I think, and I'm just super interested in historians, how they construe that and how they tell that story. And so this is Daniel K. Williams' kind of entry into that whole way of publishing. And so this is his story of essentially God's Own Party, GOP. It's a little bit of it's an allusion to a quote, actually. This is his story about how evangelicalism and Protestantism in America got so wrapped up in the right, in the Republican Party. It's a complicated story with a lot of twists and turns, and a lot of famous individuals, your Billy Grahams, your Richard Nixons, even backing up a little bit to your Eisenhowers. And it really goes through not quite the whole century. It picks up, I think, around the around World War I era. But it goes through that up until the book's publication date. It covers the Bush presidency. And it's so good. It's so good. It's very balanced. It's very critical where it needs to be critical, but it's very, from what I can tell, like in what I've read, it's a very endeavoring to be good history, a good story, and sourced in real events, and he brings the receipts for the things he talks about. It's one of my favorite accounts of kind of the history, but also the politicization of that movement. So God's Own Party, excellent book. Highly recommend it. This is a very new one, by Leah Payne, God Gave Rock and Roll to You. I had a lot of fun reading this book. It was shorter than I expected. It kind of made me wish it was more academic and longer, because I wanted to get into some more of the weeds on it. But this is a history of the CCM, the contemporary Christian music industry. Your interest in this is going to vary probably on your life experience. I grew up in, again, evangelicalism broadly. I was a kid in the 90s. I was born in 86. I was a kid in the 90s. I mean, I was a youth group kid. I was just in that sweet spot, that demographic sweet spot for CCM. I had all kinds of albums by the Newsboys and the Supertones and Jars of Clay and all that stuff, and that was all I listened to. I did not listen to quote-unquote secular music really until almost high school, probably. And so I was very keen on this book because I was really interested in what the story she told, and I had a lot of fun reading it. I'm not going to say this is the most like mind-blowing book, but it did have a lot of really genuine insights. She was, I think, appropriately critical of some of the political maneuvering that happened in that industry. She's very critical of the certain monetization impacts of essentially capitalist, profit-driven stuff that went on. I think she gives a really good account of how the industry shifted from what it was into what we see today as largely just worship music, which is just, in my opinion, way less interesting. CCM, for all of its faults and quibbles, it was at least interesting. I mean, you can't deny that it was doing some interesting stuff. And sadly, that's all gone. But yeah, she just tells the story with, I think, a really keen eye on research. She gets into some of the historical, cultural antecedents of the movement, but I almost wish, I'm not sure if I liked her having those chapters or not, because it was one of those feelings where it's almost like she pointed to it, and in pointing to it, it made me think like, oh, there's probably a lot more work that needs to be done there. Part of me wishes it would have been focused a little bit more recent history. Regardless, I don't want to get too into all that. It's a really fun book to read. It is very well researched. It is very willing to willing to be critical, willing to dive into thorny subjects like politics and race. The kind of racial angle on a lot of this stuff is really interesting, and she gets into that. She gets into the industry side, and especially the rise and collapse of the Christian bookstore as a whole phenomenon. Really, really fun book, really enjoyable to read. And I mean, it's my affinity for the subject is what it is, so that plays into my part of it. But if you're similar demographic to me, if you have similar experience to me, you probably really, really like Leah Payne's book. Okay, this is a bit of a tonal shift, but this was a harder book to read, but I would also say it's dare I say, an important book. It's a very, 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 I would almost say kind of an essential book to read right now, given what's going on in Israel, Gaza, and Palestine. And that is Side by Side, is what it's called, Parallel Histories of Israel and Palestine. And it's authored by a coalition called PRIME, which is Peace Research in the Middle East. This book is not the easiest read for a couple reasons. But man, I learned so much. And so, okay, let me say what this book is, because this is a very unique book. It's Side by Side is the title, and that's intentional, and it's also pointing to how the book is literally structured. So this coalition of historians, half of which are Israeli, half of which are Palestinian, came together to write parallel accounts of the histories of their people. So like the Palestinian historians write a history of Palestine, and then the Israeli historians write a history of Israel, and then the book splices them together literally on opposing pages. So on each page, each chapter covers roughly the same decade or the same kind of era of time. Each chapter goes chronologically, and then within that chapter, it's cut in half between the Palestinian and the Israeli account, and so you're reading them facing each other. So it's a head-spinning book to read in multiple ways, because these accounts are right there, and you have to kind of figure out, how am I going to work through this and go back and forth, and how am I going to keep track of each side. But it's also head-spinning in the sense of like which event, and this is part of the point, right? Which events that one account emphasizes and underlines, and events that the other account either leaves out or glosses over or gives a very different interpretation of. It's so interesting to see how there's overlap in certain cases and then wild divergence in certain cases. For example, one example that comes to mind is the role of the Holocaust plays understandably a prominent role in the Israeli narrative, and that does not play nearly as prominent a role in the Palestinian narrative. On the flip side, the role of the British imperial policies, like oppressive, heavy policies, plays heavily into the Palestinian narrative and is very much barely acknowledged in the Israeli side. So, I mean, that's just one example of a ton of examples you could go into when you read this book, but not the easiest book to read on multiple levels. It's sad, especially given what's going on right now, but it is. I commend the publisher for putting this out, because I think it's a really important book. And also, I will say, I've done a good bit of reading on the subject, and I'm not putting myself up as an expert at all, but I think more than any other thing I've read or listened to, this book was more helpful than anything else that I've exposed myself to yet. And just like trying to just wrap my mind around a little bit of what's going on in that region of the world and why what's happening now is happening. And the farther you learn, the more you learn, the farther deep you go, the deeper you go, I should say. My opinion is that the deeper, I'm trying to tread lightly here, the deeper you go, I think the less certain you can be in your own conclusions. And that was how I put this book down with that feeling. It's like, wow, this is an incredibly tragic and complicated and difficult story. And the way that these two stories play off each other, it just brings that all to light. And I think the intent of the book is to highlight those complications, and I think to that end it does a masterful job. So, yeah, Side by Side, put out by Prime, Peace Research in the Middle East. Okay, just a couple more to go here. Another shift. So This is a book called Family Unfriendly by Timothy Carney. Is his name, someone I was not really familiar with before I grabbed this. But the subtitle is How Our Culture Made Raising Kids Much Harder Than It Needs to Be. This was a really good book. I really liked it, and what I want to say about it is that it's a piece of cultural criticism. It's coming from a conservative place. He's a conservative Catholic who has a big family, and he is kind of the thesis of the book is that our culture, being this America, but he would say probably the West more broadly, is kind of culturally, policy and culture both militate or agitate against having big families. It just makes it hard to have a big family here. And he's arguing that's a bad thing for lots of reasons, and he goes into that in the book. But that's the core idea. That's why Family Unfriendly is the title. It's like he's arguing that our culture is unfriendly to having big families, and that's not a good thing. And he makes a largely persuasive case. I have a couple quibbles with things that I wish he would have spent more time on, things I wish he would have nuanced in a little bit differently. But I really like this book overall, and I found it largely persuasive. And one book I want to compare it to that I kept thinking about, which might sound odd because they're coming from wildly different political standpoints, was Stolen Focus by Johann Hari. And the reason that I want to compare these books is because they both take an idea. Hari's was about our inability to pay attention, and Carney's is about why it's difficult to have a big family. They both take this through line, and then they explore a wide range of cultural kind of phenomena around it. And I had the same feeling from both of them, which was just like, wow, this is a really impressive feat of researching all these different areas. So, I mean, Carney in his book, he goes into policy, he goes into economics, he goes into just culture, pop culture, representations of families. He goes into lots of stuff. And the overall scope of the argument, by the end of the book, it's kind of hard not to say, like, wow, he's got a really good point. Like, there's lots of things, there's a constellation of things, just like in Hari's book, there's a constellation of things that seem to all be kind of having this, like, sum total effect that's just not good when it comes to the point he's trying to make about having families. So wherever you are in that spectrum of having, and I picked it up because I am a parent of young kids, and I feel some of this stuff. I resonated on a personal level with a lot of the stuff he's talking about, and I also know a lot of people in my culture in my immediate culture here, who either refuse to have kids or have one, maybe two at the most. So there's something going on here that I think he has his finger on, and I would recommend that if that's of interest to you. All right. This video, I knew this was going to happen. You've been talking about books, and I just go and go. Two more I want to highlight. I'll go through these quickly. This one by Carl Henry, The Uneasy Conscience of Modern Fundamentalism. I did this as a bit of homework, historical homework. It's one I've known about for a while, and I was shocked. This book, if you know who Carl Henry was, he was very immersed in the 1940s era, the neo-evangelical emergence, or kind of around Billy Graham most prominently, but he was involved. Harold Ockenga was there. Fuller Seminary was part of this. The founding of Christianity Today, Carl F.H. Henry was very involved with at the ground level with Christianity Today, which was kind of a landmark publication in that moderate evangelical kind of wing. And I'd never read anything by him before. This is one of his landmark books, so I got it from the library, and I was shocked at how short it is. This is a tiny book. You can read it. I think I read it in one sitting. I'm pretty sure I read it in one sitting. It's that quick. It's that short. And it's good. I was ultimately a little disappointed in it, but... And what I was disappointed in is, just to give away my reaction here, he's essentially arguing for a much more forceful social political justice engagement when it comes to what he calls fundamentalism, what we would call evangelicalism. See my recent video on the New Fundamentalists for that exploration of that tension. But he's arguing that this stream of Christianity needs to be much more forceful and like publicly engaged with matters of social conscience and justice and policy. And he thinks it's a tragedy that they aren't. And I agree with him on that. I really commend his intent there. I found ultimately it disappointing because I found that he kind of ultimately lapses back on an unfortunate dichotomy of like individual personal regeneration. It still needs to be our main focus, but then the other thing we need to just make sure that we keep it there too. That's kind of way overly simplified view of his argument, but that's kind of where he lands the plane, and I found that'll be a little bit disappointing. However, it's a very interesting historical snapshot of that era in the 40s. It's a very quick read. He's very smart. He very intellectually engaged person. It's super interesting to see how he claims the term fundamentalist for himself, which is not something that anyone of his intellectual... I don't think really anyone of his like evangelical leanings, public intellectual kind of stripes. I don't think someone... It would be surprising for me to see someone claim the term fundamentalist the way he does it here. So that's super interesting. It's also just a really good window into that era, if that's something of interest to you. So that's but yeah, I kind of left me a little bit like, oh, man, there's got to be a better way out of this impasse than just doubling back onto individual regeneration and unnecessarily pitting that against social action. But that's The Uneasy Conscience of Modern Fundamentalism by Carl F. H. Henry. And then last, but certainly not least, Jonathan Haidt's new book. It's causing quite a stir, at least in my circles right now, The Anxious Generation. This kind of overlaps with Family Unfriendly in a lot of interesting ways. But The Anxious Generation it's largely about kids and teens, and it's largely about the extremely deleterious effect of social media and ubiquitous internet use and smartphone use on the development of kids and teens in our culture. So it is a little bit of cultural criticism, but it's more data, I would say. It's focused a good bit on data, and I mean, honestly, I think you could quibble with some of the ways he makes a few of his points of his arguments. But I mean, the burden of proof is going to be on anyone to say he's utterly wrong here. I just think that the data is overwhelming and it's clear, and I think his argument here is very forceful and sound and persuasive. That, I mean, it just should be obvious to us at this point that just taking all the permissions off and just giving kids the internet and smartphones and social media and the combination of all that stuff has just wreaked absolute havoc on their mental health and their development. It's very tragic and disturbing and sad, but I think his clarion call here is very well timed, and I think it's very important for people to listen to, particularly if you're a parent or a teacher or someone who works with kids. The Anxious Generation, I would honestly put it up there as like a must read. I think that it's extraordinarily important. It's already impacting how I'm thinking about it. Kind of more than anything, it's confirmed a lot of my intuitions and gave like clear data and language to further stuff that I was already thinking about, and it underlined things that I was probably already leaning towards thinking, but it does it very, very compellingly and very persuasively. And one of his big points, and this is a lot overlaps with Timothy Carney's book, Family Unfriendly, too, one of his big points is that kids need to be able to play, and we've kind of done this twofold thing where we've clamped down way too much on their kind of embodied life. We've put way too many strictures on what they can do outside and where they can roam and how they can play without someone hovering over them. We've clamped way too hard down on that, and then we've been way too naive about giving them free reign in the digital world. So the combination of those two things is a lot of what's he's arguing causing these outcomes we're seeing in terms of mental health and general wellness. And I think he's right. And it's really challenged my own thinking about how I'm going to raise my kids and how I'm going to parent and what I'm going to do, what my spouse and I are going to do with social media and phones and all that stuff. So yeah, The Anxious Generation, highly recommend it. It's pretty much anyone who's involved with, again, families, kids in any way, shape, or form. I would just seriously recommend taking a look at Jonathan Haidt's new work there. So yeah, that's a dozen books for you. Got a little bit longer than I meant to, but hopefully you can find the titles that you'd be interested in by using the timestamps below. If any of this sparks any recommendations for you, I always love getting book recommendations. I would love to hear your thoughts. I'd love to hear your reactions to any of these books. If you've read any of these titles and you had different reactions than I did, let me know. But as always, thank you for taking some time to watch.